At 9:34 a.m., a thin spray of Morse hissed through the headphones and made the room pause. The Pearl Harbor code room was hot and airless, fans chopping the smoke into slow ribbons. Operators bent over receivers, pencils ticking. A clerk tore off a strip, slid it to the man in the rumpled khaki who never seemed to sleep. Rockefort didn't smile. "Read that again." The operator did. Rabaul to Ball, inspection flight, escort of 6. Transport type, Betty. Then a name appeared as if it belonged in daylight, Yamamoto. The fans kept turning. No one spoke. He held the paper lightly, as if heat might rise from it. Coordinates, times, altitude, casual details wrapped in Japan's newest naval cipher, JN 25D. They'd been unpicking that book for months, thread by thread, learning the habits of weary staff clerks. One foolish message now had set a bright pin on a map across open water. "If this is right," someone breathed, "we know where he'll be and when." No one answered. Victory felt indecent, like gloating in a hospital ward. The translation climbed the chain, crossing the base in a locked pouch, then the continent in a diplomatic bag. In Washington, men bent over the same page under kinder light. On the wall, the Pacific looked tame, paint blue and obedient, while a forefinger traced a path across it as if that could command weather and luck. The words themselves were ordinary, a morale tour to forward fields, but their effect was not. The architect of Pearl Harbor, punctual to the minute, was about to fly through a net woven from his own radio. Rockefort wrote the entry in his log with small neat letters and stopped short of the word everyone tasted and no one said. He set the page under a coffee cup to pin it to the earth. The risk was the size of an ocean, strike, and the enemy might discover their codebook lay open, hesitate, and the chance would sink with the sun. Intelligence warned of darkness if the Japanese changed books. Operations spoke of ships burning in this same harbor, of names carved into chapel wood. Between the two, a silence like a held breath. He didn't sit in the room where the final voice spoke, but the order reached him in a tone almost casual, cruel only in its brevity. No slogans, no talk of revenge, just a time, a point in the Solomons, and a flight of American P-38s that would appear there without ever speaking on the radio. Elsewhere on the map boys were taping extra tanks to wings not meant to carry them, swearing at stubborn fittings, memorizing a minute hand. Here, headphones pressed deeper into hair, the ocean's static rising and falling like breath. Afternoon laid a bruised color over the base. Harbor water lapped at pilings that had once boiled. Somewhere, a laugh broke and died when its owner remembered. Rockefort stood at the doorway and listened to the fans. He thought of the way a nation wakes wrong and never forgets, of duty and mercy, twin words that can excuse the same act, of a punctual man stepping into a bomber certain of the privacy of his weather. He told his watch section what mattered: nothing leaves this room, everything that twitches on the band is written down. Confirmation came from the outstation that had tugged the first thread: same route, same hour. If the sky stayed clean and the schedule kept its religion, blue water would hold a meeting arranged by numbers. It was beautiful the way a trap looks to the one who draws it. Ugly to anyone else. By evening the light went the color of old honey. Operators rotated, shoulders stiff, ears ringing with ghost code. On the far strip, ground crews were painting grease pencil on canopies, counting fuel to the pound. In the jungle 1,000 miles away, engines would cough and settle, then rise into a low, sea-skimming line that left no radio trace. There would be no chatter. Only the tick of clocks and the ache of hands on throttles. Rockefort laid the decoded sheet flat and smoothed its corner with his thumb until the paper went soft. He could feel the future leaning on it. If the strike succeeded, he and his men would say nothing and move to the next intercept as if this one had been a weather report. If it failed, rumor would travel faster than aircraft. Either way, the room would go on, fans turning, pencils tapping, the ocean forever trying to talk and someone here stubborn enough to listen. Night gathered. A bugle called somewhere beyond the walls, forks clinked in a mess hall, a launch engine droned across dark water. He switched off the lamp and left the page where it lay, pale in the machine glow. The harbor breathed, and the building breathed with it. The war had waited since December for a minute like the one now walking toward them. Far to the southwest, goggles were wiped with tired thumbs, maps were folded along greasy creases, and a row of silver noses turned toward a horizon no one could see. The radios would stay dead. The air would glitter with heat. And above a strip of empty sea, at a point chosen in whispers, a moving that would match a name on paper, and the world would narrow to the space between a trigger and a heartbeat. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The conference room in Washington was dim, its blinds half drawn against the bright noon sun. A wall map of the Pacific stretched across one side, the ocean a pale blue field marked with pins and strings, a geometry of war. Coffee steamed on the long oak table. No one touched it. The men inside had been called on short notice, and even before the door closed, they knew this was not another routine intelligence update. The decrypted message lay in the center of the table, weighted by a glass ashtray. The ink was already smudged from being handled too many times. A single line was circled in red: Admiral Yamamoto, Inspection Flight, Bougainville, April 18, 0934. Admiral Chester Nimitz leaned forward, elbows on the table, reading the line again as if the meaning might shift under his gaze. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "if this is true, we're holding lightning in our hands." Across from him, a Navy intelligence officer adjusted his glasses. "It's authentic, sir. The frequency, the call signs, everything matches the combined fleet's transmission style. Our people in the Pacific have confirmed it." Another voice, older, lower. "Then we've just been handed the head of the Imperial Navy." But no one celebrated. The air in the room thickened instead. To act meant more than launching fighters. It meant killing a specific man, by name, by schedule, by arithmetic precision. For the first time in the war, they could strike not an army, not a ship, but a mind. Someone near the wall broke the silence. "We'd have to fly from Guadalcanal. 400 miles beyond our usual range. Maybe more." "We can make it work," came the reply. P-38s with drop tanks. They've been tested for long-range intercepts. "That's not the issue," Nimitz cut in. "The issue is whether we should. The word should land it hard." Around the table, papers shifted, pens clicked. The moral weight of it pressed down heavier than strategy. Yamamoto wasn't just another target. He was the man who had once written, "For 6 months after the war begins, I will run wild, but after that I have no expectation of success." He had been right. Those 6 months had carved the Pacific into graves. One officer said what many were thinking: he planned Pearl Harbor. He killed our boys. If this isn't justice, what is? But a civilian aide shook his head. "Justice, maybe. But if they realize we've broken their code, we lose everything. Every message, every convoy, every warning, gone." A voice from the corner, dry and calm: "Then make it look like luck." It was President Franklin D. Roosevelt's directive, passed down through a single sentence that would never appear in any record: "Get Yamamoto." With those 2 words, Operation Vengeance was born. The planning began within hours. Charts were unrolled, compasses aligned, and fuel consumption numbers penciled down to the ounce. They chose 18 P-38 Lightning fighters, the only planes capable of reaching the intercept point and making it back. No escorts, no radios once airborne. Silence was their camouflage. Major John Mitchell was selected to lead the mission, a calm, methodical pilot who'd seen enough of war to stop believing in luck. His squadron gathered in a tent on Guadalcanal 2 days before launch. The humidity made the air thick as soup, and mosquitoes whined under the bare bulb above them. Mitchell unfolded the map and pointed at a faint line drawn across the blue expanse. "This is the route," he said. "We fly low, 50 feet above the sea, to stay under radar. No chatter, no second chances. If you see him, you shoot. If you miss, you keep flying. We can't risk a dogfight. We'll have fuel for exactly 1 pass. A few men exchanged uneasy looks. One of them, Lieutenant Rex Barber, muttered, 1,000 miles of ocean for 10 minutes of history. No one laughed. Outside, engines coughed as mechanics tested fuel lines. The sound was steady, rhythmic, the heartbeat of something vast and terrible about to move. They were told the target was a high-ranking officer. The name Yamamoto was not spoken. But they all knew. It was written on every face. That night, Mitchell sat alone in his tent, reviewing the orders one last time. The moonlight came through the canvas, pale and ghostly. He ran his thumb along the edge of his flight map and thought of the men at Pearl, of the smoke still rising in memory. He did not think of honor or revenge, only of the strange quiet that came when duty left no room for either. At dawn, the squadron assembled by their planes. The airfield shimmered in heat, and the horizon looked like melted glass. Crewmen moved quickly, checking drop tanks, tightening bolts, adjusting the oxygen valves. The pilots climbed in without ceremony. One by one, engines roared to life, the propellers slicing the morning. Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, steady, even. Remember, radio silence. See you at the point. The formation lifted off, wheels tucking beneath silver bellies, the planes banking east over the green sprawl of jungle. Within minutes, they were gone, 18 dots swallowed by the sky. Back in Washington, the men in the conference room stood around the same table, pretending to return to other business. The coffee had gone cold. Someone lit a cigarette that he didn't smoke. No one said it aloud, but they all knew what they had done. They had chosen a moment in the future where a man would die, and then set it in motion like a clock. Outside the window, the city moved as usual, traffic, sirens, laughter somewhere far away. But inside, the air felt heavy, as if time itself had thickened around their decision. In the Pacific, the P-38s skimmed low over endless blue. The pilots could see their own reflections rippling in the sea, shadows of metal and will. Behind them trailed a silence so deep it felt like prayer. And on an island hundreds of miles ahead, a Japanese admiral was buttoning his uniform, glancing at his watch and stepping into a bomber that would never reach its destination. The engine started before dawn, a rolling thunder that shook the palms around Guadalcanal's airfield. The humid air reeked of oil and sea salt. 18 P-38 Lightning stood ready in the pale light, silver bodies streaked with condensation. Mechanics moved fast, shouting over the rising growl. Inside each cockpit, men sat quiet, gloved hands resting on throttles. The briefing had been simple: fly low, stay silent, strike fast, and don't look back. Major John Mitchell adjusted his watch. 7:24 a.m. The mission was set to the minute. He looked down the line and saw Lieutenant Rex Barber give a curt nod from his plane. No one spoke. At 7:25, Mitchell pushed his throttle forward. The roar deepened, wheels lifted, and 18 planes rose into the morning, turning east toward a horizon the color of molten glass. The formation leveled out 50 feet above the sea, flying so low their propellers kicked spray off the water. Below them stretched an endless blue plain. Above, nothing but silence. They would stay that way for more than 2 hours. No radio. No chatter. Only the steady vibration through the metal and the faint hiss of wind over the canopy. Mitchell checked his compass, his fuel gauges, his watch. Each second seemed to stretch thinner. Sweat slid down his neck. The air smelled of gasoline and salt. It was easy to forget the mission's purpose at this height, where the world shrank to instruments and endurance. But every man knew what waited ahead: a single plane, carrying the architect of Pearl Harbor. Somewhere in the line, Tom Lanfear reached inside his jacket and touched a folded letter to his mother. He'd written it the night before. Just in case, he'd said. Now, flying low over the Pacific, he wondered if she'd ever read it. Mitchell's voice finally broke the silence. Check formation. Stay tight. It was the only transmission they would make. By 9 o'clock, the sky shimmered with heat. The horizon blurred. Ahead, the first trace of land appeared, a green line etched across the water. Bougainville. The target. Mitchell scanned the map strapped to his knee. Yamamoto's plane was due at 9:34 a.m. He adjusted their heading slightly north. Small corrections mattered more than courage now. At 9:27, they passed over the coastline. Dense jungle rose below, hiding everything. Mitchell raised his hand, split formation. 8 planes climbed into the clouds above, 10 stayed low to attack. Time thickened. Then, at 9:33, Barber's voice crackled through static, 2 bogies ahead, 4 more behind them. Mitchell squinted. Tiny dots shimmered in the sunlight, one larger than the rest, flanked by fighters. The Betty bomber. That's him, Mitchell said quietly. Engines howled. The P-38s surged upward from the sea. The Japanese formation spotted them too late. Tracers flashed like white lightning. The sky erupted. Lanfear rolled hard to the right, bullets tearing past. He aimed through his sight, pressed the trigger. The P-38 shuddered as the gun spat fire. Across the gap, the bomber's left engine smoked, a black ribbon curling behind it. Barber came in from below, guns blazing. He saw metal tear open, saw flames burst along the fuselage. The bomber began to roll, one wing dipping, losing altitude fast. Break off. Mitchell ordered. Fuel was critical. The escort fighters dove to defend their commander, but it was too late. The Betty spiraled down through the clouds, vanishing into the green canopy below. A single bloom of black smoke rose, drifting above the jungle. No one spoke. The radios stayed dead. Mitchell banked west, signaling the retreat. Their fuel margin was razor thin, the ocean waited below, ready to swallow any stragglers. As they turned for home, Barber looked once more at the smoke rising in the distance. He felt no triumph. Just the hollow weight of finality. We got him, someone murmured, maybe to convince himself. The formation dropped back to wave height, the Pacific stretching endlessly ahead. Their shadows skimmed the water, fragile and perfect. The sun climbed higher, burning through the mist. The mission was over, but no one cheered. Each man knew what he had just done, not in orders or headlines, but in the quiet between breaths. Somewhere beneath that rising smoke lay the wreckage of a bomber and a man who had once believed his empire untouchable. For a while, the ocean stayed silent. Then the wind began to rise again, carrying the sound of engines west, a sound that would never reach the world until much later, when it would already be history. At 9:34 a.m., the jungle below was still. The light over Bougainville shimmered like glass, a quiet green world untouched by the noise of war. Then, in a single breath, the calm shattered. 2 silver P-38s dove through the clouds, engines screaming, sunlight flashing off their wings. Below them, 2 Japanese, Betty bombers and 6-0 fighters were flying in perfect formation, a slow procession that looked, for a moment, untouchable. Major John Mitchell's gloved hand rose in the cockpit, a silent signal. No radios. No words. Just that gesture, and every man knew what it meant. Strike. The P-38s fanned out, diving through the mist like blades. The Betty bombers gleamed in the sun, their green paint and red circles visible now through the haze. In the lead plane, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat by the window, reading a folded itinerary. He had flown thousands of miles through enemy skies, always confident in his timing, in his precision. He looked up once, perhaps sensing the shadow that passed overhead, and then the world around him exploded. Tracer fire ripped through the sky, white lines across blue. One of the escorting Zeros banked hard to intercept, its guns lighting up the air. But the American fighters were faster, climbing, twisting, diving again. Mitchell's wingman, Rex Barber, saw the lead bomber ahead. That's him, he whispered to himself. He pushed the throttle to its stop. The P-38 shook under the strain, the engines screaming as the gap closed. He aimed, just ahead of the bomber's nose, and squeezed the trigger. The plane jolted with the recoil, the smell of gunpowder filling the cockpit. The Betty's right engine burst into flame. Another burst, longer, deadlier. The bomber lurched, losing altitude fast. Barber saw its wingtip tear away, a spray of metal and smoke. For a second, he thought it might recover, but then it rolled sharply, one wing pointing toward the jungle below. "Got him," someone said over the static, the words flat, almost disbelieving. Above, Tom Lanford dove to cover Barber. A zero cut across his tail, bullets punched holes through his left wing. He banked, rolling hard, the jungle spinning below. He fired a short burst, tracers stitched across the sky, striking the enemy plane mid-turn. It caught fire instantly, breaking apart in midair. Mitchell circled higher, scanning the chaos. He saw the burning bomber falling, the plume of black smoke already trailing behind it. "Pull out," he ordered. No one argued. Below, the Betty struck the jungle with a dull, heavy sound, not an explosion, but an ending. The canopy erupted into flame, then collapsed inward. The forest swallowed the wreckage. The fight lasted barely 2 minutes. The silence afterward was almost unbearable. Engines hummed. The sea glimmered beneath them, vast and unbroken. Each pilot knew what they'd done. None said it aloud. Mitchell turned his plane westward, signaling the retreat. Fuel was running low. Every second mattered now. Behind him, the column of smoke from the crash was fading, curling into the tropical haze. Barber looked once more over his shoulder. The jungle stretched endlessly, a green ocean of leaves. Somewhere down there, amid the wreck and flame, lay the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the man who had once promised Japan 6 months of victory. And now his time had stopped, literally. Later, they would say his watch, a silver Psychotia, froze at 9:45 a.m. the moment his heart stopped, the mechanism inside it did too. As the planes climbed back toward the clouds, the men said nothing. There was no cheering, no triumph. Just exhaustion and a strange, quiet awareness that history had turned in the space of 11 minutes. They had killed not just an enemy, but an idea, the invincibility of the empire that had once burned Pearl Harbor. Yet as Mitchell checked his fuel and adjusted his heading, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. They were 400 miles from home, over open ocean, with the sun rising higher and their tanks nearly empty. He pressed the radio switch once, breaking the silence at last. "Form up. We're going home." In the distance, the island disappeared beneath a haze of heat. The ocean spread below, endless and bright. No one looked back. But each man, in his own mind, saw that single column of smoke rising from the jungle and felt the same cold thought, that somewhere, somehow, they had just changed the course of the war. And as the formation turned south, the Pacific swallowed the echoes of the battle. The jungle grew quiet again, the air heavy with the smell of burning fuel. At 9:34 a.m., the world had held its breath. By 9:35, hell had opened its eyes. The ocean stretched forever, blue, blinding, merciless. The battle was over, but the war inside every cockpit had just begun. The 18 P-38 Lightnings that had struck Yamamoto were now scattered across the sky, thin trails of smoke marking the ones that had taken hits. Below them, the Pacific shimmered like metal. There was no sound but the steady thrum of engines and the faint hiss of wind through bullet-torn wings. Fuel gauges trembled near empty. The formation that had started in perfect precision was breaking apart, one plane lagging behind, another wobbling on a crippled propeller. Major John Mitchell forced himself to stay calm. His eyes flicked between compass and fuel, between sky and sea. "Hold formation," he said quietly into the radio, though static swallowed half his words. "Just hold." No one answered. Talking now would cost concentration, and maybe fuel. The silence pressed in like weight. The heat inside the cockpit was suffocating, sweat pooling under flight suits. Every pilot knew what a single miscalculation meant, a slow descent into the water, then hours, maybe days, drifting until the ocean claimed them. Tom Lanford looked down through his canopy. The water was calm, almost beautiful, the kind of stillness that mocked them. He whispered into the mic, voice dry and cracked, "If the Japanese spot us now, we're fish food." No one laughed. The minutes stretched. The island of Bougainville had long vanished behind them, swallowed by haze. Ahead was nothing but horizon, 400 miles of open sea between life and oblivion. The engines droned like a single heartbeat, fading and returning in rhythm with the fear that pulsed in each man's chest. Mitchell checked his map again, the paper trembling in the airflow. Every few minutes he recalculated, tracing invisible lines back toward Guadalcanal. There was no room for error. He could feel the vibration in his bones, the way the P-38 struggled against its own weight. One more hour, maybe less, before the tanks ran dry. Suddenly a voice broke through the static, faint, panicked, "I'm losing pressure, left tank's gone." It was Lieutenant Hines. His plane began to drop from formation, its right engine sputtering, coughing black smoke. Mitchell turned his head just in time to see it spiral downward. For a moment, it looked like Hines might recover, then the P-38 hit the surface. A flash of spray, a bloom of white foam, and then nothing. The ocean smoothed itself over, indifferent as always. "Keep flying," Mitchell said. His own voice sounded foreign to him. "Don't look back." Lanfear gripped the controls tighter, jaw clenched. The silence after the crash was worse than the explosion itself. They all knew what it meant, one gone, maybe two, maybe more before they reached land. The sun climbed higher. The air shimmered. Another plane fell behind, fuel gone, propellers slowing. The pilot's voice came over the radio, calm, steady, "Tell them we did it." Then the line went dead. The P-38 glided downward, touched the sea, and vanished into silver. Hours blurred into one long moment of endurance. The men stopped thinking of glory or revenge. There was only distance and fuel and hope. By the time the first outline of Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon, half the formation was gone. The remaining planes limped toward the island, engines coughing, exhaust smoke streaking behind them like ghosts. Mitchell felt something twist in his chest, relief tangled with guilt. "Home in sight," he whispered. The landing strip shimmered in the heat. One by one, the surviving P-38s touched down, tires screeching on cracked pavement. Mechanics ran forward, shielding their eyes from the dust. The planes rolled to a stop and went silent. Mitchell sat motionless in his cockpit, breathing hard. The air smelled of oil and burned metal. Around him, the other pilots stayed seated too, no cheers, no words. Just that stunned stillness of men who had come back from something the world would never quite understand. When he finally climbed down, his legs nearly gave out. A young ground officer ran up, face pale. "Sir, did you?" Mitchell nodded once. "It's done." The words felt heavy, final. No one asked how. They all knew better. Orders came that night from command, the mission was classified. No reports, no photographs, no talk, not even among themselves. Operation Vengeance would not exist on paper for decades. That night, as darkness fell over Guadalcanal, the pilots gathered near the mess hall, sitting in silence. The jungle hummed with insects, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled across the sea. Barber lit a cigarette with trembling hands and said softly, "We got him. But why doesn't it feel like winning?" Mitchell didn't answer. He looked out toward the black horizon, where the ocean met the sky, the same ocean that had taken their friends, the same sky that had carried them to history. No medals, no headlines, no victory songs. Just the sound of rain beginning to fall, quiet and steady, washing the salt from their faces. 3 days later, far across the Pacific, the Japanese found the wreck of Yamamoto's plane. And even they, the soldiers who revered him as untouchable, could not believe how it had ended. The jungle was dense, wet, and quiet, too quiet. The search party moved slowly through the undergrowth, machetes slicing through vines that hung like ropes. The air smelled of fuel and death. It was April 20th, 1943, 2 days after the attack. They had followed the thin column of smoke that still rose faintly above Bougainville's trees. Somewhere ahead, they knew, lay what was left of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man Japan had called the spirit of the empire. Lieutenant Hamasuna led the way, sweat running down his face. Mosquitoes hovered around his neck, ignored. He had served under Yamamoto for 5 years and still couldn't believe what the radio message from Rabaul had said: the Admiral's plane failed to arrive. That couldn't be true. Yamamoto never failed. Then they saw it, a scar of broken trees, the smell of burning metal, blackened leaves curling like paper. The wreckage lay scattered across a small clearing. The fuselage of the Betty bomber had torn open on impact, one wing sheared off against a tree trunk. Smoke still rose from the twisted metal. Hamasuna stopped, staring. "There," he whispered. The men stepped closer, their boots sinking into the mud. Inside the shattered cockpit, among the wires and ash, sat Yamamoto. Still upright in his seat. His right hand rested on the hilt of his sword, the white glove spotless despite the fire. His uniform was torn, his face calm, almost peaceful, eyes half open, as if still watching the horizon. For a long moment, no one spoke. The jungle around them buzzed faintly with life, birds, insects, wind, the sounds of a world that hadn't noticed its god was gone. Finally, one officer bowed deeply. Another saluted, his voice trembling. He died as he lived, perfectly composed. They gathered his remains carefully, wrapping him in a white sheet. A young medic, barely 20, reached to remove the Admiral's wristwatch. Its crystal was cracked, hands frozen at 9:45. He hesitated, then whispered, even time stopped for him. As they worked, a question passed through the group like a shadow: how could this happen? The Americans had known exactly where he would be, down to the minute. It didn't seem possible. But no one dared to say it aloud. That night, back at base, the survivors built a small altar in the jungle clearing. They lit candles made from ration wax and bowed their heads. The air was heavy with smoke and disbelief. One of them murmured, "If even he can die, what's left of the empire?" The words hung there, unanswered. In Tokyo, news of Yamamoto's death arrived 2 days later. Officially, the government announced that the Admiral had been killed while heroically leading an inspection flight under enemy fire. Newspapers printed his photograph with black borders. The Emperor declared a national day of mourning. To the public, it was a story of noble sacrifice. But among the officers who truly understood what had happened, silence ruled. They knew it was not heroism, it was exposure. Someone had read their secrets. The cremation took place on April 21st. His ashes were flown back to Tokyo in a sealed urn draped with the rising sun. Crowds lined the streets, bowing as the cortege passed. Many wept openly. In the Diet building, politicians spoke of vengeance and divine honor. But behind their words, fear was growing. If Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the mind of the Navy, could be hunted and struck down in his own skies, then no one was safe. In the jungles of Bougainville, the wrecked Betty bomber was left to rot. Vines began to crawl over the fuselage, leaves covering the scars of fire. The jungle, patient and endless, took back what war had left behind. Years later, when American troops landed on the island, they found the remains almost untouched, the pilot's seat still there, the watch still frozen at 9:45. It would end up in a glass case in Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, a silent artifact of the moment when Japan's invincibility died. In that hour, the myth had ended. A god had fallen from the sky. And for the first time, even his followers understood, the war that had begun in triumph would end, inevitably, in ashes. They came back as heroes. But they couldn't tell anyone why. The mess hall on Guadalcanal smelled of coffee burnt to tar and wet canvas. The men sat in their flight suits with the salt still crusted on their collars, staring at tin plates they didn't touch. Engines coughed somewhere out on the line, rain ticked on the tent roof like a nervous hand. No one spoke about the column of smoke that had risen over Bougainville. No one spoke about the silence after. A runner appeared in the doorway, breathless. Major Mitchell. Sir, Admiral's office. Heads lifted, then dropped. Mitchell wiped his palms on his trousers and followed the boy out into the heat. The room he entered was cool and precise, maps pinned at the corners, pencils sharpened to needles. Admiral Nimitz stood by the window, hands behind his back. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He only said, officially, "This never happened." Mitchell blinked. "Sir. You heard me." Nimitz's voice was even, as if reading weather. "There will be no reports that say what you did. No citations. No photographs. If anyone asks, you were on patrol and encountered enemy aircraft. Nothing more." Mitchell nodded once. He felt the order land inside him like a stone dropped into deep water, no splash, only weight. He saluted, turned, and left with the feeling that some part of him had been packed in a crate and nailed shut. Word traveled without traveling. In the barracks that night, men smoked in the dark, the glow of their cigarettes moving like fireflies. Someone said, not loudly, "We killed the man who bombed Pearl Harbor, and I still can't sleep." No one answered. They listened to the jungle hiss and the distant roll of surf and pretended the quiet was mercy. Two mechanics cornered Rex Barber near the flight line, grease up to their wrists. "Did you get him?" one asked. Barber looked past them at the black runway and said, "We got home." That was all. The squadron clerk typed a report that said nothing and filed it under a code that meant not to be opened. The intel boys retrieved maps, erased grease pencil circles, and locked the safe. A courier collected the gun camera reels that should have been history and flew them away to a vault no one in the tent would ever see. Even the mess sergeant learned to stop asking why the pilots looked both older and less certain. The letters home were careful lies. Routine operations. Weather fair. Don't worry. A few men tried to write the truth and tore the pages into strips so thin even the stove couldn't remember them. Barber folded an empty sheet and sealed it anyway. Days bled into each other. There were other missions, other routes flown low over glittering water. At night, the same door in the mine swung open, the bomber tipping, the wing tearing, the jungle swallowing the final second. The image arrived without sound and left without permission. In Washington, the file was stamped and put away where even curiosity went to die. The path that had led from a room of headphones to a slash of smoke over Bougainville was reduced to initials and numbers that would not be read until men had gray hair and the world needed a different kind of story. In Pearl, the codebreakers bent back over their sets as if nothing had happened, because officially nothing had. Mitchell received a folded piece of paper that mentioned fuel consumption, bearing accuracy, and maintenance commendations. It did not mention choosing a minute for a man to die. He placed it in his footlocker and closed the lid gently, the way you close a book whose ending you don't like. The only celebration came in the form of silence. No questions at chow. No toasts in a tin-roofed bar. The ground crew changed a cracked tire on a plane that had carried history and discussed the weather. A chaplain walked past the revetments at dusk, hat in hand, and didn't knock. Sleep, when it came, was uneven. One pilot woke to the smell of burning rubber that wasn't there and sat on the edge of his bunk until the dark thinned. Another dreamed he was flying forever over a sea that didn't end, the gauges nailed to empty, the horizon glued in place. The order about secrecy spread wider, classified, indefinite. Even in the after-action poker games, the hand they had played could not be laid face up. They learned to carry it like a scar under a shirt. Some days it itched. Some days they forgot it was there until it pulled when they moved. A week later a rumor arrived the way rumors do, half whisper, half certainty. The Japanese had found the wreck. A watch stopped at 9:45. A funeral was coming. The men looked at each other and looked away. They had expected relief. Instead there was a kind of hollowness that metals don't fill. Mitchell walked alone to the edge of the strip at dusk. Far out on the water the sky burned down into copper and went dark. He thought of the Admiral in Tokyo who would now speak into a radio with a different voice, and of the engineers somewhere painting names on planes that would never carry theirs. He thought of the words stamped across the truth, silence. Back in the tent someone turned off the lantern. The jungle resumed its thousand small conversations. A pilot on the far cot said to the dark, "We did our duty." Another voice answered from nowhere, "Then why does it feel like a secret stole it from us?" No one replied. Outside, the ocean breathed. Beyond that, on an island of paper and black cloth, a nation was preparing to mourn a man it had called untouchable. And the men who had touched him would sit very still and say, if asked, that nothing had happened at all. Black banners hung from government buildings, and the streets of Tokyo moved like a slow river of black suits. Loudspeakers crackled with a careful voice that never wavered. The Admiral had fallen heroically while leading an inspection flight. People stopped where they stood. Some bowed. Some simply looked at the pavement because looking up felt like betrayal. The air smelled of incense and coal smoke, wind-rattled paper streamers tied to lampposts. There were no tears in public, only a hush heavy enough to bend the day. Inside the Navy Ministry, the corridors were quieter still. Doors shut softly. Footsteps tried not to echo. On a long table lay the flight plan no one wanted to touch, next to a map marked with a neat red arc. A young officer traced it once with his eyes and then looked away. "Without him, the fleet is a body without a brain," someone said, not loudly. No one argued. They remembered his warnings, the ones he had spoken even before the war, how a conflict with America would begin like a storm and end like a famine. In a letter written in the late 1930s, he had told a politician he trusted, "We will run wild for 6 months," and after that, he had no confidence. The 6 months had stretched almost to the day. Now the voice that had said no when others said glory was gone. Outside, the official story took root. Newspapers framed his portrait in black borders. Priests intoned sutras. Children in schoolyards lined up 2 by 2 and bowed to a photograph on an easel. The word used most often was immortal. In back rooms, the word was exposed. Staff officers knew the truth had traveled faster than morning, the enemy had met him as if the sky itself had set an appointment. Meetings multiplied. They produced plans that felt like copies of older plans. The combined fleet talked of decisive battle, the army talked of holding lines that were already fraying. A chart on the wall said oil in tight script, and the circle next to it kept shrinking. A liaison officer summarized the mood in a note he didn't send: "We have ships and courage and slogans. We do not have time." At the funeral, the urn arrived draped in the rising sun. The streets along the route were crowded and meticulous, men in black, women in plain kimonos, soldiers standing like statues. The cortege passed through a city that still carried its nighttime scars, neighborhoods dark from rationed electricity, corners where the smell of burned wood lingered. Hands rose in unison. Heads bowed. One old man, hat pressed to his chest, murmured, "He kept us honest." A woman beside him said nothing, her eyes were closed as if listening for an engine that would not return. In the shrine's quiet, the ritual unfolded with the exactness the Admiral had admired in everything. The urn was placed, the names were chanted, the offerings set down in their appointed order. A junior officer, hands shaking, presented a wristwatch with a cracked face. It had stopped at 9:45. The priest accepted it without surprise, as if time pauses for duty. Afterward, the politicians spoke of vengeance and steel. Their sentences were round and complete, like shells returned to their cases. Yet when the microphones were removed and the photographers left, the room sagged. A minister asked, almost to himself, "Who will say no now?" No one answered. The silence lasted long enough to become the answer. In the mess halls of distant bases, sailors ate in quiet they could not name. Rumors arrived on folded sheets and left without faces. Some said the Americans had simply been lucky. Others said luck does not keep time to the minute. A petty officer made a small altar under his bunk, a paper crane and a sprig of pine. He lit a sliver of candle and watched it burn down without a flicker. It felt wrong to pray for guidance when the man who had provided it was ash. Strategy did not collapse in a day, it thinned. Orders took longer to travel and seemed to fade as they crossed water. The fleet could still fight, it did. But the cadence had changed. There was effort without direction, daring without a voice to braid it into sense. Officers who had once argued with the Admiral now echoed him without conviction, like men repeating a poem they barely remembered. Across the city, a naval cadet stood in a queue for rice that did not reach the end of the line. He stared up at a poster of planes banking in formation and said to his friend, "They told us gods do not fall." His friend shook his head. Then they were not gods. The cadet folded the thought into his pocket like a contraband ration. In homes with shuttered windows, mothers smoothed uniforms that would soon be too thin for winter. In factories, women tightened bolts until their palms blistered and listened to the foreman read the announcement again. In a small office near the harbor, a clerk stamped the date on a telegram and felt the ink bleed. National Mourning, the page said. His hand wrote the words without believing them. Night drew its curtain early. The city exhaled into curfew. Somewhere a radio played a march at low volume, a tune that had sounded like promise a year before and now ran like water over stone. On a rooftop, a lieutenant looked out over the black-spotted grid of Tokyo and tried to think in straight lines. He managed a single conclusion that felt like treason: we lost more than a man. We lost the only doubt we trusted. Far away, on an island where men had flown and returned with their mouths closed, a different quiet held. The world would later call it history. For now, it was two silences facing each other across an ocean, one draped in flags, the other in orders stamped classified, indefinite. And in that gap grew the question that would not leave either shore: was this justice that steadied a winning hand, or vengeance that would keep a man awake long after victory slept? The veterans' hall was quiet except for the hum of an old fan and the slow tick of a clock that no one seemed to hear. Afternoon light spilled through blinds, cutting the room into narrow golden stripes. On the wall hung a photograph of a P-38 Lightning banking over the sea, silver, timeless, untouchable. Beneath it, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age: Yamamoto's death confirmed by declassified files. It was 20 years after the war. The men had grown into their silence: gray hair, steady hands, faces that looked both proud and uncertain. They sat around a table, glasses sweating in the heat, eyes drawn again and again to the picture on the wall. Tom Lanfear opened a magazine and read softly, his voice rough from age and cigarettes. "I didn't see an enemy that day," he read. "I saw a man who believed as deeply as we did." No one spoke. The fan turned. Outside, a car backfired, sharp, like flak, and for a second everyone froze, the reflex still buried in their bones. Then the sound faded, and they were just old men again. Major Mitchell stared at the cracked glass covering the clipping. "We thought killing him would end the war," he said quietly. "But wars don't end that way, do they?" Lanfear shook his head. "No. They just change who remembers." In a display case on a nearby shelf rested a broken watch, its hands frozen at 9:45. A small plaque read, "Recovered from Bougainville, 1943. Mitchell leaned closer. The reflection of his own face trembled across the glass. "That's when his plane went down," he murmured. Time stopped for him. But ours kept going, all the way here. Barber, sitting across the table, said, "We called it vengeance. But I think it was something colder. Proof, maybe, that we could reach anyone." Mitchell turned toward him. "And once you can reach anyone, you stop asking if you should." The men exchanged glances, the kind that carried whole conversations. They had learned long ago that guilt could outlast medals. On another table lay the now declassified message that started it all: coordinates, times, a single word: Betty. The paper looked harmless, almost innocent. Yet it had chosen who lived and who didn't. For decades it had been locked away while the world called their flight a triumph. They knew better. Triumph doesn't echo like this, in a room that still smells of dust and jet fuel. A mechanic raised his glass. To the mission, he said. And to the man we never met. The others followed, their glasses touching softly, not celebration, not apology. Just acknowledgement. Mitchell smiled without joy. He believed in his emperor. We believed in our orders. Maybe that makes it fair. He looked back at the photo. Or maybe that's what makes it tragic. Outside, wind brushed the flag against its pole. Inside, the clock went on ticking, relentless, indifferent. Years later, people would see their faces in museums, young, confident, frozen in the moment before history weighed them down. Captions would speak of strategy, precision, success. None would mention the silence that came after, or how victory can sound like nothing at all. Because when Yamamoto's plane fell from the sky, two beliefs collided, and both were lost before they ever hit the ground. They called it Operation Vengeance. But for the men who lived it, it was never vengeance. It was just the moment they realized that even justice can feel like regret.